The photographer said, "Smile," and Richard Hargrove did exactly that. Not at his son, at his son's suit. It was a Thursday afternoon in late May, the kind of day where the sun hits the white tent fabric just right and everything looks expensive. The flowers, the champagne flutes, the women in their pastel dresses. Hargrove Graduation Party 2019. 63 guests. An open bar that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And in the middle of all of it, Daniel Hargrove walked across the lawn in a navy suit that his father recognized immediately as wrong. Not wrong like a stain. Wrong like a statement. Richard leaned toward his wife, Margaret, and said it loud enough for the table to hear. $40, I can tell from here. My son, showed up to his own graduation party in a $40 suit. Laughter. Not everyone, but enough. Daniel heard it. Of course he heard it. He was 12 feet away. But he didn't flinch, didn't redden, didn't look down at the fabric the way his father expected him to. He just looked at his dad with those quiet eyes, the ones Richard had always found unsettling, even when Daniel was a boy. And he smiled back. A real smile, which somehow made it worse. "Dan, come on," his brother Ethan called from across the tent, already loosening his Xenia tie with the comfort of a man who had never once worried about the cost of anything. "We're doing photos. Try not to embarrass the family more than you already have." More laughter. Bigger this time. Margaret touched her pearls and looked away. Daniel walked toward the camera. What none of them knew, not Richard, not Ethan, not Margaret with her pearls, not a single one of the 63 guests sipping their expensive champagne under that white tent, was that 48 hours earlier, Daniel Hargrove had signed a 41-page acquisition document. He had bought them, not their house, not their car, not their lifestyle, their company. The thing Richard Hargrove had spent 30 years building, the distribution empire he talked about at every dinner table, like it was a cathedral he'd constructed with his bare hands. It now belonged to the man in the $40 suit. Daniel knew it when his father laughed. He knew it when Ethan made the joke. He knew it when his mother looked away. And he said absolutely nothing. Because that's the thing about patient people. They understand something that arrogant people never learn. The reveal has to be worth the wait. This one was going to be worth it. To understand why Daniel did what he did, you have to understand what it feels like to grow up as the wrong son. Not the bad son, not the troubled son, just the wrong one. Ethan came first. Ethan was everything Richard Hargrove believed a firstborn should be: loud, charming, broad-shouldered. The kind of guy who walked into rooms like he already owned them. He had his father's jaw and his father's confidence and his father's absolute certainty that the world existed to accommodate him. Daniel came 3 years later and was from the very beginning something different. He was quiet, observant, the kind of kid who fixed things instead of breaking them, who read the instruction manual before touching the toy, who asked why more than he asked how much. He was not what Richard Hargrove had imagined when he imagined a second son. So Richard did what a certain kind of father does with a child who doesn't fit the mold. He minimized him, not violently, not with cruelty you could point to and call abuse. It was softer than that and somehow worse. The kind of dismissal that hides inside jokes, inside comparisons, inside the specific silence a father gives one son when the other son speaks. Ethan's baseball trophies were on the mantle. Daniel's academic awards were somewhere in a box in the garage. We just haven't found the right place for them yet. Ethan got the car on his 16th birthday. Daniel got a handshake, and you're old enough to figure transportation out. Ethan was brought to board meetings at Hargrove Distribution starting at age 17. He needs to understand the business, Richard said. Daniel asked once if he could come, and Richard laughed. Actually laughed, and said, "What would you even do there?" What Daniel did instead was get a job. He was 15. He told his parents he was doing it for experience, the kind of vague teenager answer that parents accept because it sounds responsible. The truth was simpler. He didn't want to need them anymore. Need, he had figured out early, was the mechanism they used to control him. If he stopped needing things from them, they lost their power. His first job was bagging groceries at a Kroger 6 blocks from school. He made $8.75 an hour. He saved almost all of it. Then at 16, a second job, weekends, cleaning offices for a commercial cleaning company. He learned very quickly that no one looked at the person cleaning their office. They talked freely on the phone, left sensitive documents on their desks, discussed numbers they'd never discuss in a formal meeting. Daniel said nothing. He cleaned. He listened. He started understanding how businesses actually worked, not the polished version his father performed at dinner, but the real version, the one with the anxiety underneath it. At 17, he learned basic plumbing from a YouTube rabbit hole that started at midnight and ended 6 hours later. He started doing small jobs on weekends for neighbors. Cash, under the table. He was good at it, patient, methodical, the kindest worker who left a space cleaner than he found it. His parents didn't know any of this. Or rather, they knew he had some little job, and they found it vaguely embarrassing in the way that people who have never worried about money find work itself vaguely embarrassing. It confirmed their narrative. Daniel was the lesser son, the one who would always be scraping by. "Your brother is going to run the company someday," Richard told Daniel once, directly, at the kitchen table when Daniel was 17. Not cruelly. That was the thing. He said it the way you'd state a forecast. It will rain on Thursday. Ethan will run the company. Daniel looked up from his homework and said, "Okay." And Richard took that as acceptance. It wasn't. Daniel got into the University of Michigan on a partial academic scholarship. He told his parents he needed help with the rest. Richard wrote a check without looking up from his desk. Not generous, not resentful, just absent. Daniel thanked him, cashed the check, and enrolled. Then he got 3 jobs: campus facilities maintenance, 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. before classes; freelance IT work, evenings; weekend plumbing and handyman jobs for families in the Ann Arbor area, under the name D. Hargrove. Reliable home services. He kept a rating of 4.9 stars. He had 43 reviews by the time he graduated. 3 separate clients asked him to come work for them full-time. He majored in finance, not because his father suggested it. His father had never suggested anything for Daniel except, "Keep your options open," which, translated, meant, "I haven't made plans for you because I don't expect you to need plans." Daniel chose finance because he had watched, from the outside, how money actually moved. He'd seen it in the offices he cleaned, the spreadsheets left open, the stress in phone calls, The difference between companies that were growing and companies that were quietly dying. He wanted to understand the mechanics. He understood them. His professors noticed something in him that was unusual. Not just intelligence. There were plenty of intelligent students. It was the patience. Most finance students wanted to understand how to make money fast. Daniel wanted to understand how to make money invisibly. He was drawn to acquisition structures, to holding companies, to the kinds of arrangements where ownership and operation were completely separate. He wrote his senior thesis on it. His advisor called it unusually practical for an academic paper. He graduated with a 3.94 GPA and zero fanfare. Ethan, 3 years earlier, had graduated with a 3.1 and a party at a steakhouse that Richard rented out entirely for the evening. 50 people. Open bar. Richard gave a toast that lasted 11 minutes. Daniel's graduation dinner was at the family home. 7 people, including him. His mother made salmon. Richard spent most of the meal on his phone, periodically looking up to ask Ethan about the new client he was courting at Hargrove Distribution. Daniel ate his salmon. He'd stopped being wounded by it years ago. That was the gift his childhood had given him, actually. The ability to observe his family clearly, without the fog of needing their approval. He saw his father the way you see an object from a distance, completely, without flattery. And what he saw worried him, not emotionally, financially. Hargrove Distribution was in trouble. He'd suspected it for a while. The signs were small, but readable if you knew what to look for. The kind of tells that don't show up in the press releases, but live in the details. Vendors his father had used for 20 years quietly dropping off. A regional contract renewal that got unusually quiet. The CFO, a careful woman named Sandra Park, who had always made Richard seem more competent than he was, leaving for a competitor after 14 years. Richard replaced her with a 29-year-old who had gone to Ethan's college and played golf with Ethan on weekends. The company wasn't failing yet, but it was pointing in that direction. Clearly. Obviously. The way a car points toward a guardrail before it hits. Daniel watched. He said nothing. He went home to his apartment in Detroit, where he was working at a mid-size private equity firm by day and still doing weekend handyman work. Not because he needed the money anymore, but because he liked it. Because there was something true about fixing a broken thing with your hands that he'd never found in an office. He put the money in an account he had opened at 21 under an LLC he'd registered in Delaware, under a name he'd chosen deliberately, almost playfully. Handyman Holdings. He added to it every month, quietly, patiently. He watched Hargrove Distribution get worse. Richard Hargrove wasn't a stupid man. This is important to say because stupid men lose businesses in obvious ways, and the story is simple. Richard was smart enough to build something real, and just arrogant enough to then refuse every signal that it was breaking. The distribution industry had shifted. Everyone knew it. The margins that had made regional distributors wealthy in the 90s and early 2000s were getting compressed from both ends. Big national players on one side, tech-enabled logistics startups on the other. The companies that survived were the ones that adapted, invested in software, restructured their operations, sometimes merged, sometimes pivoted, sometimes made painful cuts before the cuts became catastrophic. Richard knew this. He had sat in industry conferences and heard it said, in those exact terms, by people far smarter than him. He had nodded. Then he'd gone home and done nothing, because doing something would have meant admitting the model he'd spent 30 years perfecting was obsolete. And that was a sentence Richard Hargrove's ego could not form. Instead, he expanded. A new warehouse in Columbus, financed on debt. A fleet of new trucks, also debt. A marketing campaign that cost $400,000 and produced approximately nothing. He promoted Ethan to VP of Business Development, a role that Ethan interpreted as licensed to take clients to expensive dinners and close deals that looked good on paper and hemorrhaged money 6 months in. The Columbus warehouse underperformed by 40% in its first year. The truck fleet sat partially idle while fuel costs spiked. The new clients Ethan brought in required contract terms that Sandra Park would have recognized immediately were unsustainable. But Sandra Park was gone. The 29-year-old who replaced her was good at golf and bad at reading a balance sheet under pressure. By early 2019, Hargrove Distribution was carrying $14 million in debt, and the number was moving in the wrong direction. Richard knew. He didn't say he knew. He made louder pronouncements at dinner about the company's future, which is what certain men do when the thing they're most afraid of is the truth. He talked about the next chapter and strategic positioning and what we're building toward. And around the table, people nodded because nobody wanted to be the one to say, "Richard, I've seen the numbers." Daniel had seen the numbers, not from the inside. He wasn't a part of the company, had never been brought in, had never been asked. He'd seen them the way a careful outside analyst sees them, through public filings, through industry databases, through a quiet conversation with a former Hargrove distribution vendor who, over a beer at an industry event, told Daniel more than he probably should have. "Your dad's company," the vendor said, "is one bad quarter from a very hard conversation with its lenders." Daniel drove home that night and sat at his kitchen table for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and started building a model. What Daniel did over the next 14 months was not flashy. There was no dramatic moment, no single big swing. It was more like watching someone very carefully disassemble a lock from the inside. He started with the debt. 2 of Hargrove Distribution's largest creditors were mid-size commercial lenders, the kind that don't make the news, that operate quietly in the business financing space, that get nervous when a client starts missing certain targets. Daniel reached out to both, not as Daniel Hargrove, but as a representative of Handyman Holdings, LLC, a Delaware-registered acquisition vehicle with a clean balance sheet and a patient investment thesis. The pitch was simple, and he'd rehearsed it until it sounded like he was saying it for the first time. "We think there's real underlying value in the distribution assets. We'd like to discuss acquiring your position at a negotiated discount." Lenders hate uncertainty. They hate it more than they hate taking a small loss. When a creditor suspects a borrower is heading toward default, the chance to sell their debt, even at a discount, starts to look very attractive. It removes the uncertainty. It converts a maybe into a certainty. Both lenders said yes. Not immediately. There were months of back and forth, due diligence requests, counteroffers, silences that lasted 3 weeks and felt like a year. Daniel was patient through all of it. His colleagues at the private equity firm, the ones who knew him mostly as the quiet guy who was exceptionally good at distressed asset analysis, had no idea. His family had no idea. He worked the deal in the early mornings and late evenings, at his kitchen table, in the margins of weekends. He also, during this same period, acquired 2 minority equity positions from early investors who had quietly decided the ship was listing and wanted out. He paid fair prices. He asked for confidentiality. He got it. By the time Daniel walked across his parents' lawn at a graduation party in May of 2019, in the $40 suit, in the sunshine, under the white tent. Handyman Holdings controlled approximately 34% of Hargrove Distribution's debt and held equity positions totaling another 11%. He wasn't the owner yet, but he was close enough. And when his father laughed, Daniel smiled and did the math one more time in his head and let the moment be exactly what it was. The last time Richard Hargrove would ever have that kind of power over him. Summer 2019 was when it stopped being theoretical. Hargrove Distribution lost its second largest client in July, a regional grocery chain that had been with the company for 11 years and quietly, without a press release, chose not to renew. Richard found out through Ethan, who found out through a panicked sales rep, who found out when the client simply stopped returning calls. The Columbus warehouse, already underperforming, took on a 12% vacancy rate when a secondary tenant backed out of a deal that, again, had been structured in a way Sandra Park never would have approved. The 29-year-old CFO produced a Q3 report that landed on Richard's desk on a Tuesday morning, and by all accounts, Richard sat alone in his office with the door closed for almost 2 hours afterward. The number at the bottom of the report was not an abstraction anymore. Hargrove Distribution needed a capital infusion of at least $8 million by the end of the fiscal year, or it would begin defaulting on its restructured debt. Richard had 60 days, roughly, to find the money. He called his bank first. They were polite and unhelpful. He called 2 private equity contacts he'd cultivated over the years at charity events. One didn't call back. One called back and said the terms would be aggressive. He called a larger distribution company about a potential merger, and the conversation lasted 19 minutes and ended with the other party saying they'd be in touch, which meant they wouldn't. Richard Hargrove was running out of options, and he knew it, and the knowing was the worst part, because he was a man who had spent his entire life being right about things, being the one who saw clearly, being the one who built while others hesitated. And now he was in his own office, in the building with his name on the lobby directory, calling people who were politely telling him no. He did not call Daniel. It didn't occur to him. His assistant forwarded a letter that arrived during the 3rd week of September. It was from a law firm Richard didn't recognize, requesting a meeting on behalf of Handyman Holdings, LLC, a significant creditor and equity stakeholder in Hargrove Distribution, Inc. The letter was professional, courteous. It requested a board-level meeting at the company's offices at the earliest opportunity to discuss a structured resolution of the company's current capital position. Richard stared at the name, Handyman Holdings. He turned it over in his mind. He'd never heard of it. He asked his team to look into it. They found a Delaware LLC with clean registration, a small public footprint, and a holding structure that led to another LLC that led to another. The kind of clean nesting that good acquisition lawyers build specifically to make beneficial ownership opaque until the moment the owner decides it shouldn't be. Private, his lawyer told him. Very private. But the debt positions are legitimate. They own the paper. Who are they? Richard asked. We don't know yet, his lawyer said. Richard agreed to the meeting. He had no real choice. Daniel drove to Detroit the evening before the meeting, not to prepare. He was prepared. He had been prepared for months. He drove because he needed to feel the city, to move through it, to remind himself of something. He parked on a street in Midtown and walked. He passed the building where he'd done his first commercial cleaning job at 16. Different tenant now, same structure. He drove past the neighborhood in Ann Arbor where he'd fixed a burst pipe at 6 a.m. on a January Saturday for a young couple with a newborn who didn't know who else to call. He thought about that morning, the cold, the particular satisfaction of a fixed thing, the mother coming into the kitchen with the baby on her hip and looking at the repaired pipe under the sink like it was a small miracle. He had kept every tool he'd ever bought. They were in his apartment, in a red metal toolbox that sat in the closet next to suits that cost considerably more than $40 now. He kept the toolbox because it wasn't symbolic to him. It was literal. Those tools were the mechanism. Every job he'd done with them was $1 in the account. Every dollar in the account was a piece of what he now owned. His phone buzzed. Ethan. He looked at the name on the screen for a moment, then let it go to voicemail. He already knew what Ethan was calling about. Word had gotten around the family. Not the specifics, but the worry. The company was struggling. Dad was stressed. Do you know anything? Ethan would ask. The way Ethan always framed questions that were really about himself. Not, are you okay? Do you know anything useful to me? Daniel put his phone in his pocket and walked back to his car. He slept well that night. People always find this surprising when he tells the story later, that he slept well. They expect him to describe lying awake, heart pounding, rehearsing the confrontation. But the truth is that he had spent years doing the hard part quietly, in the dark, while everyone was looking somewhere else. The meeting tomorrow was just the moment when the lights came on. He set his alarm for 6 a.m. He pressed his shirt. He chose a suit that cost $1,400, which he noted privately, and with something that was not quite a smile but close, was exactly 35 times the cost of the suit his father had laughed at 4 months ago. He drove to the office that used to be his father's. The Hargrove distribution boardroom was on the 4th floor. Corner room, east-facing windows, a long mahogany table that Richard had bought specifically because it projected the right combination of authority and permanence. Around it, that morning, sat 6 people. Richard at the head, Ethan to his right, the young CFO with the look of a man who has been reading bad news for 3 months straight, 2 board members who had been with the company since the early days and were now somewhere between confused and frightened, and Richard's lawyer. Daniel's lawyer arrived first and took the seat at the far end. Then Daniel walked in. He was carrying nothing. No briefcase, no folder, no prop of any kind. He was wearing the $1,400 suit, and he'd had a coffee on the way up, and he felt, he would later say, completely calm. Not the performative calm of someone suppressing emotion. The real kind. The kind that comes from having made your decision a long time ago and simply being in the process of watching it unfold. He walked to the empty chair at the other head of the table. He sat down. Richard stared at him. The room was quiet in the specific way rooms get quiet when something is happening that no one has a framework for yet. "Daniel," Richard said. Just the name, not a question, not a greeting. "Hi, Dad." Ethan looked between them. "What is this?" Daniel's lawyer placed a document package in the center of the table and slid copies toward each seat. It was the ownership summary, clean, organized, annotated for clarity. The debt acquisitions, the equity positions, the total stake, the transfer of operational authority that had finalized 10 days ago. "Handyman Holdings," Daniel said, "is mine. Has been since 2017. The CFO picked up the document. He looked at the first page, then the second. His face did the thing faces do when information comes in that changes the shape of everything around it. A slight slackening, a reorientation. Richard did not pick up the document. He was still looking at his son. How long have you? "I started building the position about 2 years ago," Daniel said. "I acquired the debt from First Meridian and Cascade Commercial in early 2018. The equity positions came through the Q private sale in January. The controlling stake transferred fully last week." "You don't have the capital for this," Richard said. And then, immediately, visibly, he heard how that sounded. Because he was talking about Daniel, the son he'd assumed could never have the capital for anything significant. "I've been working since I was 15, Daniel said, "and I'm good with money." Ethan set down the document. Something was moving across his face. It started as disbelief and was traveling somewhere that looked like it might arrive at shame, though it hadn't gotten there yet. One of the old board members, a man named Gerald who had known Richard for 25 years, leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "Well," he said, very quietly. "All right then, what happened next was not the screaming match that movies would write. Richard was too proud for that. And Daniel had never been a screaming kind of person. What happened was quieter, and because of that, heavier. "I want to understand," Richard said. His voice was controlled. His hands were flat on the table. Is this some kinda..." "It's a business decision," Daniel said. "The company was undervalued and mismanaged, and heading toward a default that would have cost everyone in this room. I stabilized the debt position, I have a restructuring plan, and I intend to bring in a new operational team." "Mismanaged," Richard repeated. "Yes, by me. By you." Daniel said it without softness, but without cruelty either, just clearly. The Columbus expansion was overextended. The CFO transition was poorly handled. The client retention strategy didn't exist. These aren't opinions, they're in the numbers. Richard looked at his son for a long moment. And here is the thing that Daniel would come back to years later when he told this story. His father, in that moment, looked old. Not physically, something else. Like a man who had just realized that the story he'd been telling himself about who he was and who his son was had been wrong in a way that couldn't be quietly revised. "So what does this mean?" Richard said. "Practically." Daniel looked at his lawyer, who slid a second document to the center of the table. "The restructuring requires a full leadership transition. The new board structure is in Section 3. Your position as CEO is... He paused. Not for effect, just for the weight of it. Because this was his father. And whatever his father had done, whatever years of smallness and dismissal Daniel was carrying in his chest, this was still the man who had taught him to drive, and who once, when Daniel was 7 and had the flu, had sat on the edge of his bed at 2 a.m. and watched cartoons with him until he fell asleep. The good memories don't disappear just because the bad ones piled up on top of them. Your position as CEO is terminated, effective today, Daniel said. There's a severance package in the document. It's fair. More than fair, actually. Ethan stood up. You can't just... He stopped. Because he could. They all knew he could. Dad. Ethan, Richard said quietly. Ethan sat back down. The room was very still. Richard reached out and pulled the document toward him. He looked at the first page. Then he looked up at his son across the length of the mahogany table. The one he'd bought to project authority and permanence. I didn't know, Richard said. I know, Daniel said. I didn't know you were... I know, Dad. A pause. The suit, Richard said. At the graduation. Yeah. You knew. When I... You already knew. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Richard Hargrove looked down at the document. He stayed like that for a moment, just a man looking at papers, in a room with his name on the building, at a table he no longer sat at the head of. Then he picked up the pen. Daniel kept the $40 suit. It's in a garment bag in the back of a closet in his house in Ann Arbor, next to the red metal toolbox. He doesn't take it out often. It's not a trophy. He's not that kind of person. It's more like a record. The way some people keep journals, he kept that suit. A document of a specific time and a specific choice, and what it cost him to make it. Hargrove Distribution was restructured over the following 18 months. New CFO, Sandra Park, actually, who came back when the terms were right, and later told Daniel she'd wondered for years who would finally clean up the mess. New operational strategy. The Columbus warehouse repurposed, the fleet right-sized, the client relationships rebuilt with the kind of patience that only comes from people who understand that trust is slower than ambition. The company turned its first profit under the new structure in Q4 of 2020. Ethan came to Daniel's office 6 weeks after the boardroom meeting. He didn't call ahead. He sat in the chair across the desk and was quiet for a moment, and then said, I need to understand what I did wrong. It was the most honest thing Ethan had ever said to him. Daniel spent 2 hours walking him through it. Not the company. That was simpler. He walked him through the years, the dinner tables, the trophies on the mantle and the box in the garage, the car on Ethan's 16th birthday, and the handshake on Daniel's. He said it without anger, with the flatness of someone reporting weather. This happened, then this, then this. He wasn't performing pain for Ethan's benefit. He was just being accurate. Ethan cried at one point. Daniel handed him a box of tissues and waited. I didn't know I was doing it, Ethan said. Most people don't, Daniel said. Richard never came to the office. He sent a letter, handwritten, 3 months after the meeting. It was short. It said that he understood Daniel had made good decisions and that he hoped the company would thrive. It said, and this was the line Daniel read twice, I think I confused quiet with small. I was wrong. Daniel read it once, put it in the drawer of his desk, and went back to work. Margaret called every Sunday. They talked about nothing important: weather, a show she was watching, a neighbor's renovation project. She never mentioned the boardroom. Neither did he. That was its own kind of understanding. Here is the thing Daniel says now, when he talks about those years. The tools were never the point. The point was what holding them taught me. That the value of a thing has nothing to do with how it looks on the outside. A $40 suit can belong to a man who owns everything in the room. A handyman can carry more capital in his mind than any executive carries in his title. The world will look at your uniform and make its decision. That's fine. Let them look. The work you're actually doing is somewhere they can't see yet. He still does one handyman job a month, always on a Saturday, always for someone who can't afford to pay much. He fixes what's broken. He leaves everything cleaner than he found it. He still has a 4.9 rating. The 43 reviews are now 412. And somewhere in Ann Arbor, in a red metal toolbox, in a closet next to a $40 suit, there are tools that built an empire one quiet Saturday at a time. Never judge the value of a person by the uniform they wear today. Tomorrow, they might own the building you work in.